The icebreaker MV Akademik Shokalski pressed through the frigid waters of the Arctic Ocean, carrying a group of tourists eager to witness the pristine wilderness of Rangel Island. Dr. Emma Frost, a seasoned polar bear researcher, stood among them, her breath visible in the icy air. She clutched the railing tightly, her eyes scanning the horizon with a mix of hope and resignation. After years of disappointment, her dream of seeing a polar bear in the wild had become a near obsession. "We've spotted something unusual ahead," shouted a crew member, breaking the monotony of the cold morning. The tourists surged to one side of the ship, their binoculars and cameras aimed at the distant shoreline. Emma followed their gaze, her heart quickening. Small white shapes dotted the coast, their movements faint against the stark gray of rock and ice. "Sheep," maybe one passenger suggested, his voice tinged with doubt. Others murmured in agreement, squinting at the indistinct forms. Emma frowned, gripping her binoculars. Something about the shapes felt off, though she couldn't yet put her finger on it. She adjusted the focus, and her world seemed to tilt as the blurry shapes sharpened into something unmistakable. Polar bears. Dozens of them. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had spent decades chasing fleeting traces of these elusive predators, and now, against all odds, there they were. But something was wrong. Polar bears were solitary by nature. A gathering like this, if it could even be called, that was unprecedented. Her scientific mind struggled to process what she was seeing. The shoreline wasn't just dotted with bears, it was swarming with them. Hundreds, at least. Emma's binoculars slipped from her grasp, clattering against the deck. The sound jolted nearby passengers, but her eyes remained fixed on the unfolding scene. Around her, the murmur of voices rose to a crescendo of disbelief. Cameras clicked furiously, and the ship's guides exchanged hushed, urgent words. "This can't be real," one guide muttered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "They don't. They're not supposed to do this." Emma's hands trembled as she leaned forward, her mind racing through decades of research and fieldwork. What could possibly have driven so many bears to congregate here? Hunger? A shift in ice patterns? Desperation? She knew polar bears were facing mounting challenges as climate change melted their hunting grounds, but this was something else. The ship edged closer, cutting through the choppy waves. The bears came into sharper focus, mothers guarding their cubs, massive males prowling the perimeter, and juveniles tussling in the snow. The sheer number of them was staggering. The air buzzed with tension, the bears' movements synchronized as if controlled by some unseen force. A few stood on their hind legs, their black noses pointed toward the approaching vessel. Emma felt their gaze, a collective intelligence assessing the humans as intruders. She glanced at the captain, who had joined the group on deck. "We need to document this," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Every detail. This could rewrite what we know about polar bear behavior." The captain nodded grimly. "We're recording everything." But he trailed off, his eyes narrowing. "What are they doing?" Emma turned back to the scene, her heart sinking as she realized the truth. The bears weren't merely gathering, they were feeding. Strewn across the rocks were the remains of a massive whale carcass, its flesh torn apart by dozens of ravenous predators. The realization brought a strange mix of relief and dread. A whale's death had provided a feast, but it also hinted at the fragility of the ecosystem. How desperate must these bears be to abandon their solitary instincts and converge like this? Her thoughts drifted back to her early days in the Arctic, when she had been a wide-eyed volunteer at a research station in Svalbard. Back then, her dreams had been simple: to see a polar bear, to understand them, to protect them. The older researchers had tempered her enthusiasm with caution. "Bears don't just show up when you want them to," Dr. Johansson, her mentor, had warned her. "The Arctic's not a zoo. You're on their turf, and they don't owe you an appearance." Emma had taken the advice to heart, throwing herself into her studies. She analyzed fur samples, tracked migration patterns, and devoured every scrap of data she could find. But the bears always remained just out of reach, their presence hinted at in footprints and claw marks, never seen in the flesh. Her colleagues had dubbed her the Ghost Chaser, a nickname she bore with quiet determination. And now, after 2 decades, she stood in the midst of the most extraordinary polar bear encounter ever documented. The passengers around her continued to chatter, their voices a mix of awe and fear. "Is this normal?" one woman asked, her camera lens trained on a particularly large bear that seemed to be staring directly at her. Emma shook her head. "No, this is unprecedented. Polar bears are solitary hunters. They don't form groups like this unless something's gone terribly wrong." The woman's eyes widened. "Gone wrong? What do you mean?" Before Emma could answer, a sudden movement caught her attention. One of the younger bears had ventured closer to the water's edge, its curiosity piqued by the ship. It sniffed the air, its massive paws crunching against the icy ground. Other bears followed suit, their dark eyes fixed on the humans as if considering their next move. "Everyone stay calm," the captain said, his voice firm but low. "We're in their territory. Don't give them a reason to feel threatened." Emma's pulse quickened. She knew the statistics: polar bears could sprint at 25 miles per hour and swim for miles without tiring. Despite their size, they were agile, powerful predators. If they decided the ship was a threat or worse, an opportunity, the situation could escalate quickly. The bears remained at the shoreline, their movements deliberate and unnervingly coordinated. Emma forced herself to breathe deeply, to focus on the data she was gathering. Her field notebook lay forgotten in her cabin, but she committed every detail to memory: the number of bears, their interactions, the composition of the group. This wasn't just a feeding frenzy, it was a survival strategy, born out of necessity and shaped by the changing Arctic landscape. As the ship lingered, Emma's initial awe gave way to a profound sadness. This congregation of bears, as extraordinary as it was, symbolized a world out of balance. Polar bears weren't meant to live like this. Their lives were solitary by design, each bear carving out its own path across the ice. The loss of sea ice, their primary hunting ground, had forced them to adapt in ways that defied their very nature. She thought of the cubs nestled close to their mothers, their fur stained red from the whale's flesh. What kind of future awaited them? Would they grow up in a world where such gatherings became the norm, where survival depended on scavenging and desperate measures? Or would they vanish entirely, their white coats fading into the annals of history? The ship's engines hummed, a subtle reminder of the human presence intruding on this fragile ecosystem. Emma glanced around at the tourists, their faces lit with wonder and unease. They had come seeking an adventure, a glimpse of the Arctic's wild beauty. Instead, they had been confronted with its harsh realities, laid bare in the form of hundreds of hungry bears. She turned back to the shoreline, her resolve hardening. This moment, this unprecedented gathering, was more than a spectacle. It was a call to action, a stark reminder of the urgency of protecting the planet's most vulnerable species. For the first time in years, Emma felt a renewed sense of purpose. The bears had given her more than she had ever dared to hope for, and she wouldn't let their plight go unheard. She reached for her binoculars, ready to document every detail. The world needed to see this to understand what was at stake, and she would make sure they did. "I've never seen anything like this," one of the guides murmured, breaking the spell of stunned silence. "It's a congregation. But why? What could bring so many polar bears together?" The answer lay just beyond the shoreline. Drifting in the icy waters was a whale carcass, enormous and grotesque. The smell of decay was carried by the wind, sharp and pungent. The bears had gathered for a feast, a rare bounty in the stark Arctic landscape. Emma's eyes widened as she realized the significance of what she was seeing. The bears weren't behaving naturally, they were starving, drawn here by desperation and the promise of sustenance. The other passengers began whispering, a mix of awe and fear threading through their voices. "Are we safe?" someone asked, stepping back from the railing. The guides assured everyone there was no immediate danger as long as they stayed on the ship, but the sight of so many apex predators in one place was unnerving. Emma's thoughts churned. This wasn't just a rare sighting, it was a stark reminder of the challenges these creatures faced. Climate change, melting sea ice, and dwindling prey had driven them to this extreme. She turned to her assistant, Callum, who had joined her on the expedition. Start recording everything, Emma ordered, her voice firm. We need footage, notes, anything we can gather. This could be crucial data. Callum nodded and began filming, his hands steady despite the weight of the moment. As the ship edged closer, the bears' behavior became more apparent. They jostled and growled, competing for access to the whale carcass. Cubs darted nervously among the adults, learning the brutal lessons of survival. A particularly large male snarled, swiping at a younger bear that had ventured too close. The younger bear retreated, limping, but not before snapping at a nearby cub in frustration. The chain of aggression rippled through the crowd like a storm. Emma's heart ached. She had spent her career studying polar bears, and here was the culmination of everything she'd feared, a species pushed to its limits. This is what we've done to them, she murmured, half to herself. We've taken away their home, their food, their chance to live as they're meant to. A passenger nearby overheard her. You mean climate change, right? The woman asked, her face pale with concern. Emma nodded grimly. The ice is their hunting ground, Emma explained. Without it, they can't reach seals, their primary food source. They're forced to scavenge, to take risks they wouldn't normally take. This, she gestured to the shoreline, is a sign of how desperate they've become. The woman's eyes filled with tears as she turned back to the spectacle. Around them, other passengers were reacting similarly, their initial excitement giving way to a somber understanding. The Arctic wasn't a pristine wilderness untouched by human hands, it was a fragile ecosystem teetering on the edge of collapse. Emma's resolve hardened. She couldn't let this moment pass without making it count. Turning to the ship's captain, she said, I need to get closer. I need to study them, document their behavior. The captain frowned. That's dangerous. Even from here, they're unpredictable. And if the ice shifts... I know the risks, Emma interrupted, but this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. If we don't record this, who will? After a tense pause, the captain relented. We'll send a small team in a Zodiac, but you'll have to be quick. Emma nodded, adrenaline surging. She selected Callum and 2 experienced guides to accompany her. They donned thick layers of protective clothing and climbed into the small inflatable boat. As the Zodiac was lowered into the water, Emma felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. This was her chance to witness polar bears up close, to understand their plight in a way that no research paper ever could. The Zodiac's motor hummed softly as they approached the shoreline. The smell of the whale carcass grew stronger, almost overpowering. Emma's stomach churned, but she forced herself to focus. Every moment counted. They stopped at a safe distance, careful not to disturb the bears. Emma raised her camera, capturing every detail, the way the bears moved, the interactions between adults and cubs, the tension that crackled like electricity in the frigid air. Her notebook filled with observations, each scribble a piece of the puzzle she'd spent her life trying to solve. One bear, a gaunt female with a ragged coat, caught Emma's attention. The bear's ribs were visible beneath her fur, a stark contrast to the image of robust health that polar bears were supposed to embody. She was accompanied by 2 cubs, both alarmingly small for their age. Emma's heart broke as she watched the mother nudge her cubs toward the carcass, only to be driven back by larger males. This isn't sustainable, Emma said quietly, her voice tinged with despair. They can't live like this. Callum glanced at her, his expression grim. What can we do? He asked. It was the question Emma had been asking herself for years. She didn't have an answer, not yet. The female bear suddenly turned her head, her dark eyes locking onto Emma's. For a moment it felt as though time stopped. Emma held her breath, unable to look away. The bear's gaze was piercing, filled with a mix of curiosity and weariness that spoke of a life lived on the edge of survival. Let's head back, one of the guides said, breaking the spell. Emma nodded reluctantly. They'd gathered enough data for now, but she knew her work was far from over. As the Zodiac returned to the ship, Emma's mind raced with ideas. She'd use this footage, these observations, to raise awareness, to push for action. The world needed to see what she'd seen to understand what was at stake. The bear's future depended on it. Back on the ship, the passengers crowded around, eager to hear what Emma had learned. She shared her observations, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders. This wasn't just a scientific discovery, it was a call to arms. As the ship began its journey back through the icy waters, Emma stood at the railing, watching the bears fade into the distance. She vowed to fight for them, to ensure their story was told. The Arctic had revealed its harsh truths, and she would not let them be ignored.